If you can read and follow rules, you can administer a contract. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. Everything from the setup to the regular ongoing tasks, and then what to do if things change. It's unbelievably simple, but fundamentally, it's the difference between getting paid or not. Okay, so the first point I want to make is that building stuff is way harder than administrating a contract. The temporary works designed for a 6-meter high in-situ wall, or the process through which you connect a solar farm to the grid, is much harder than a reminder in your calendar to submit a payment claim. From what I see in the industry, people are way better at the hard, technical, building stuff side of things, but they're absolutely terrible at the contracts admin side of things, which is such an unbelievable pity, because that reminder in your calendar to submit a payment claim is arguably as important as building the thing itself. And it's why you see contractors lose money on projects they actually deliver successfully. Good contracts admin is how you actually get paid for the work you're doing and maintain your entitlements. If your client delays the project by 3 months and you have to pay a project manager for an extra 3 months, then you should be able to claim that. Now, the fundamental principle behind this video is going to be a contract is simply a rule book, and contracts admin is following the rules. And there's 4 domains to contract management. We've got our upstream contract formation, which is bidding. We have our downstream contract formation, which is procurement. Then we have our upstream head contract, contract administration, and downstream subcontract administration. We're only going to be focusing on the administration phase of this though. So what actually happens after the contract's been signed? There's 3 phases I'm going to talk about. We've got the setup phase, which is done once at the start of the project. We have the business as usual, which is the regular ongoing tasks that we do monthly or weekly as the contract specifies. Then we have our change management processes, which is what we do when something changes, when the client requests us to do extra work, or we think the client hasn't done something they said they would. So number 1, your first thing you should do whenever you get a new contract is you should read and understand the contract with the goal of turning it into a set of individual tasks, which is basically what a contract is. It's a massive to-do list. I like to break down my task into 3 buckets. We've got the setup tasks we do. For example, we need to get all the insurances and give our clients the certificates. We've got our business as usual tasks. For example, once per month, we have to issue an updated program to the client, or once per month, we have to prepare and submit a payment claim. Then we have our change management tasks. For example, when client issues a change to scope, we have to submit a notice to them within 7 days. This list of tasks is based on what the contract is telling us to do. Each of these tasks is going to have a point in time which you have to do it. For example, our payment claims have to be done on the 25th of each month. We have an action owner who is responsible for completing that task. And I think this is a very important step. When we're doing the setup of the project for each of these tasks, we should establish a template or framework. So for example, payment claims, we set up a template through which we're going to claim. Or for our monthly report, we're simply going to submit a project dashboard like this, showing our schedule progress and our cost progress. Setting this up is unbelievably simple. We just go through the contract, we read through each clause, and we turn it into a task. For example, clause 27, completely random one I've chosen from AS 4000, is the contractor, within 14 days after the date of practical completion, the contractor shall remove all temporary works and construction plan. That is just a task we have to do. It has a task and it has a date which we have to complete. Or for example, if our client notices defective work, we have to rectify this within 8 days after we receive written notice from them, or we are in breach of the contract. Okay, so number 1 is our task list. The second setup, which will really be done in the pre-construction and contract negotiation phase, but in our contract setup phase, we really want to reshape, but it is to establish these baselines. The baselines really tell us when we have to do the work, how much we can spend to do it. The scope baseline, again, which is an understanding of the drawings, the specifications, what we are actually obligated to build, and you want to include it as well, a quality baseline. Quality baseline being the actual inspection and test plans we have to do to complete the work. Now, none of these have to be particularly complex. I think one of the problems I see people make is that they think if you have to do a schedule has to be a 6,000 line Gantt chart that articulates everything perfectly and exactly captures your methodology. The reality is, it is more important to have a schedule than a perfect schedule. I also think there's a bit of a trap around a lot of these schedule cost baselines that people want them to be too perfect with too much detail. It is much better to simply have a high-level program that shows all of your client milestones in it, shows them on the critical path being a series of activities that, if delayed, delayed project completion. And then you can tie these back to contract milestones and show that if your client is late in giving you access to site, then you can claim a delay. Or if your client is late in approving the design drawings, then you can show that it impacts the date that you can place the order for the procurement, which pushes back your completion date. The reality is, unless you have very clear baselines like this, it is almost impossible to make accurate claims. So like even a schedule like this is so unbelievably powerful when managing a contract. If you have an original baseline of when the project's meant to start, when the design's meant to be done, how long your client has to approve it, the key construction milestones and when they need to occur, and you simply track the start date, the baseline completion, and the actual completion, and just prepare this and maintain this and keep this active throughout the execution of the project, it is going to be so easy to make claims later on. Similarly, with your cost baseline and basically breaking down the project scope into a schedule of values or how you're making payment claims to your client and subcontractors. And again, it's a little like I bring up baselines here, but a lot of these baselines are established during contract formation. But if you can have your contract sum broken down with a bill of quantities, a quantity against each item, it is much, much easier to claim variations. The next part of our contract setup is establishing our registers. Registers are just a way of tracking different lists of items. For contract management, I think there is really 5 key registers you need. You need a correspondence register. So this is where you track every single bit of correspondence with your clients. That means emails, formal written instructions, meeting minutes, conversations where they've told you to do something and it's been verbal. You can follow up with an email. But basically, every single bit of correspondence with your client and your subcontractors you want in a register somewhere. Now, an unbelievably simple way that I like to do this is I like to set up a project email address like project@yourcompany.com. Then every important bit of correspondence, you simply CC the project email address in and you link it to something. It doesn't have to be Airtable. This is just an example of a software. You could use Google Sheets. You could use Microsoft 365 connector and simply log all this correspondence into some sort of database like this. So every time that email address, project@xyz.com, receives an email, it goes into our correspondence register. Now, we can get fancy and get it to use AI or something to auto classify the emails into other sets of registers. But as a very basic thing, all our project correspondence is suddenly in this searchable database. We can add meeting minutes and other things to it. So like when I have to find the correspondence with our clients where they told us that we weren't going to be responsible for clearing and grubbing, I can go to my correspondence register and I can very easily find that. If I can tell you one thing, tracking correspondence, having access to what was discussed and knowing what was agreed on at different stages is ammunition for any commercial dispute. As an extension of this, we would also want a RFI register. So this is more like formal instructions or questions we've raised to the client. These will particularly be clarifications around the scope of works. For example, something's unclear on the design drawings they've issued us, we send them a question. Now, importantly, this is going to be these registers, and again, the baselines, everything, it is for both the upstream and the downstream contract management. So the contract with our clients and also the contract with our subcontractors. The next one we want is a variation register. So this is for every contract, our head contract, our subcontracts, we have a list of changes to scope and the status of these changes. So important to track these variations, and particularly if in terms of just understanding the financial position and the scope, because all contracts will have variations. There are no contracts that don't have variations because it's impossible to perfectly articulate the work. Simply tracking all the new variations, the status of them, whether approved or not approved, all these things, it is so essential to basically keeping track of your entitlements. Now, whether you do this separately or not, you could also have an EOT register. I personally think it makes more sense to track your extension of times within your variation register because they're related. Change the scope can have a change of cost and a change of time. Again, another one you should have is a risk register, or this could be either where you're forecasting cost as like potential variations or potential changes, and then also a payment claim register. So a register of all the claims you've made to the client, your subcontractors have made to you, how much you've paid today. You would be surprised how many companies do not simply track the payment amounts, the submitted amounts against the contract value, the percentage claimed, and the previous claims. Again, this isn't just about contract administration. Helps you with cash flow forecasting and all these other domains of construction management. Although it is more common than you think, people overclaiming and other people not realize. Now, the fourth thing I think it is good to set up is your recurring time-driven tasks. All of them go into some sort of shared project calendar. So 25th of each month is when we make our payment claims. The Monday of each week at 10 a.m. is when we have our client meeting. The Friday of each week is when our project engineer goes through the RFI register and follows up on any outstanding items. So really having a very clear list of all the tasks you need to complete each week, who's responsible for them, and putting them into a calendar. I hope you're starting to get an understanding of how unbelievably simple this is, but it is so fundamental to successfully delivering a project. All right, now we've spoken about our project setup. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our business as usual and time-driven tasks. So these are the regular, ongoing, repeating tasks that we would have to do each week, month, or however often. Now, again, it's important to understand that I'm just going to go through the general set of tasks. You probably have some more specific ones to your project. For example, you might have a specific environmental reporting requirement. So these are just general ones. Every contract will have a specific activity. Okay, BAU task number one, no one does it, but so important, is just to maintain your construction program. Simply tracking against your baseline schedule when tasks actually started and when tasks actually finishes. You should show every milestone. Again, this should be set up in your pre-construction phase. And all you're doing during the construction phase is simply tracking when things are actually happening, how much work is getting done, and the percentage complete for each task. Again, without a maintained and relevant schedule, it will be so hard to make any time-based claims. Through the schedule is how you recover your preliminary costs and avoid liquidated damages. So maintaining it and making sure it is relevant is absolutely essential. So the second regular ongoing task will be our payment claim. So typically this will be like the 25th day of each month, but again, the contract will tell you exactly when. You submit a claim showing how much work you've done. And again, you'll do the exact same thing when your subcontractors submit claims to you. So if I show you a typical progress claim, I just downloaded that, and we can see a progress claim will have a claim against the contractor items and a claim against any variations, and they'll always be broken down into some sort of schedule of values where we can see the contractor is claiming against a percentage complete against different items in the contract. There is always going to be what they've claimed previously and then what they are claiming in this claim. Typically, once we submit a claim or a contractor submits a claim to us, we would do our own independent verification of this claim. So for example, if they're saying we want to claim 20% of the sprinkler design and installation, we might look at that and we think, no, they've only done 10% this month. Or if we look at the total quantity of sprinklers they need to install and it's not at 90%, which is the total amount they claim, we might respond to them and say, we assess that you've only completed 80% of the work. Now, payment is always a contentious issue on construction contracts, again, because cash flow is the thing that sends contractors broke. So understanding also the payment legislation in your country, how long you have to respond to claims, and what happens when you don't actually provide feedback to a claim is very important within the context of payment particularly. So more so than the other tasks, I would always be making sure that you're following the timeframes in the contract and any relevant legislation when it comes to payment, particularly when you're reviewing payment claims from subcontractors. Because a lot of people don't realize that in Australia, for example, according to SOPA, if your contractor makes a claim and you don't approve it within the time frame, or you don't respond to it to say you think they've claimed too high within the time frame allocated according to the contract or according to SOPA, you can actually be liable to pay the full amount of the claims. It's very important to understand time frames you have to respond to claims. Again, put it in the calendar, set a reminder, make sure it gets done. Okay, the next thing is we've spoken about the schedule and payment. The next one would be regular ongoing monthly reporting. This is presenting reports to your client to say, this is how much work we've done. This is where we're up to in the schedule. If it's a cost plus project, you might have to report some sort of cost and forecast to show that you're spending money, maybe what the key risks are, and just an overall status update. Again, in the setup phase, set up a template. For example, you could use a dashboard like this in Mast, and then how you're going to report on progress to the client. Then the next business as usual task, which again goes without saying, is you actually need to do the work. So doing the work in accordance with the contract. The key thing here I'd really stress is that you're doing the work as defined in the contract. You understand the drawings, the specifications, the work you are actually obligated to do, and you are very carefully following and doing the work as specified in the contract. Because the thing we want to avoid here is scope creep. Scope creep is doing more work than you were originally contracted to do without getting some correspondence increase to the project budget. So for example, you originally had to install normal windows. The client says, oh no, we actually want double glazing windows, which are more expensive, but you don't put in a variation to claim those extra costs. The only way you can control scope creep is to understand your scope baseline. So business as usual task is you obviously have to do the work, but you have to pay attention to what the work actually is as defined in the contract. And then we have to always maintain our insurances, our security, our statutory obligations. This is basically following the boring stuff in the contract. If the contract says we need to have public liability insurance, we need to maintain our public liability insurance. We need to have workers' compensation insurance. We have to maintain workers' compensation insurance. And then as an extension to what I spoke about in the setup phase, again, just record all your conversation. This is going to be the best ammunition you have when it comes to managing contract claims. Okay, so business as usual, all about our regular ongoing tasks, but what do we do if things change? So this is our change management. Basically, this is all about variations, or if you're in the US, change orders. Variation, long story short, is work that wasn't included in the scope baseline. If we're doing work that originally wasn't included in the scope baseline, then we need a correspondence change to the cost of the project, the budget, and the time we have to do it. So pushing back our practical completion date. If originally we had to do 1 concrete slab and now we have to do 2, it's going to cost us more money and it's going to take us more time. There's really 2 types of construction variations. There's client-initiated change. This is where the client asks us to do something extra. So originally we were building a building. It had 1 elevator shaft. The client goes to us during the design phase and says, hey, we would like to add a 2nd elevator shaft. Can you please submit a variation for this? The important thing to understand about client-initiated variations is there is no disagreement about the fact that the variation exists. The only disagreement you can have will be about the cost and time impact. Then we have the other category of variations, which is contractor-initiated variations. So for example, we go to our new building construction site and we begin bulk earthworks and we find an unidentified underground service. The original contract, we think, says that we were not responsible for latent conditions, including underground services. So we have to send a notice to our client and we have to say, we have identified this underground services. These are not in the initial baseline. We need to assess the impact of this change. Now, the important thing to understand about contractor identified variations is that the existence of the variation isn't automatically agreed to. So there's fundamentally 2 things you can disagree on. The fact that the variation exists, the client might turn around and say, no, you're responsible for underground services. You could have done your own investigations. We don't accept that's a variation. The second thing they could disagree with, they could say, yep, we agree that's a variation, but we don't agree on the cost and time impacts. So really, both of these variations are going to more or less follow the same process where the variation gets identified either by you or your client. You put in some sort of notice to say, this is a variation and we need to assess the cost and time impacts. And then contracts will have a time bar period in them, a certain period of time within which you have to respond, after which you might not be able to claim with it. For example, if that unidentified service, you can't claim for that 6 months later. You can only claim for that 5, 10 days, whatever the notice period in the contract is. Which, when you think about it, is actually fair. It's not fair to claim for an unidentified service that you picked up at month 1 when you're 6 months into the project. So that's why time bars exist, although they are painful. You just have to pay attention to how long you have to give to notify the client. Then once you've done that, once you've given the notification, you said we're assessing the cost and time impacts, you then assess that impact. You prepare a cost of the additional works and a duration or change to the practical completion date. Again, that is why you need a really clearly identified cost and scope baseline. So for that example, where we identify an underground service, we might say, well, now we need to have a non-destructive digging truck. We need to excavate and pothole that service. It's going to slow our excavator production rate. This is lead to this increase in direct costs. It's also going to take us 4 weeks longer. So we need to cover the costs of our project manager and project engineer who are on site for 4 weeks longer. Plus, we want to change the practical completion date. So that is the assessment and the pricing and the variation. Again, so important. Going back to tracking correspondence, it is so important that you track all your correspondence. It's going to make it so much easier to prove these variations exist. Now, when we were setting up the time baseline for the project, that is why it is so important to have a clear baseline of when everything is going to occur, a critical path that shows the series of activities that, if delayed, can delay project completion. If you cannot show the earthworks are on the critical path, you cannot claim extra time for the unidentified service because you're not actually changing the duration of the project. But if you can show the earthworks are on the critical path of the project and this extra 4 weeks to deal with this unidentified service is going to push back the completion of the project, you can push back your liquidated damages. So extension of time claims are where you show, based on the original baseline schedule, there has been some delay event that wasn't in your original scope, and you can push back the completion of the project. Well, there's really 2 reasons this is an important concept to understand. So number 1 is going to be like the time aspect. If your practical completion date is the 15th of July, you can push it back to the 15th of August, which pushes back when you're going to incur liquidated damage. The other side to this is being able to cover extra preliminary costs. Project takes a month longer, you still need site sheds, you still need a project manager, you still need a project engineer on site. Those, you should be able to claim those costs. Now, the final sort of change management issue is to talk about is disputes. Your client may flat out reject this claim you've made, or you might have made a payment claim and they might have assessed it differently and you get into a dispute about it. Disputes become where you begin to involve lawyers and it starts to become much more messy commercially. But really, the contract will specify how you are meant to resolve disputes. For example, you might have to issue a notice to your client to say, we categorically reject this and we are taking action XYZ where we're stopping works. It's very important to understand what the contract says here. And when you're talking about getting into disputes like this is when you should really start involving construction lawyers. And again, I'm going to keep saying it. It is why it is so important to track all of the project correspondence. So basically, the 80-20 of this entire topic is read the contract, follow the rules, and record all of your correspondence. Business as usual, it is a calendar-driven task. All those tasks should be in your calendar. The change management, it is about identifying what has changed and what is the process the contract follows to say it. If you do want to learn more about broadly project controls, which is really the underlying discipline of how we maintain our baselines, which is absolutely essential for contract administration, then watch this video next.